So maybe if we dive into the history, maybe a good place to start is the often told story of how LSD was kind of discovered, and I guess it kind of came into this pre-existing work on mescaline. But maybe would you mind giving us a little recap of that story?
Sure, the LSD story.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm sure that some of your listeners will be familiar with this, so apologies to anyone who already knows this story or can tell it in their own vocabulary. Um, yeah, it's quite a colorful and fascinating story of a chemist in Switzerland, Albert Hofmann, who in 1938 first synthesized LSD, or D-lysergic acid diethylamide. And as the story goes, first told in his own words, in his own book about LSD, his problem child, he was hired by Sandoz pharmaceutical company to explore headaches, cluster headaches, and he was looking for different kinds of substances. So it wasn't his goal to discover LSD per se. And in fact, the vial sat on a shelf for several years before he had firsthand experience with it. And in April 1943, as the story goes, some from a vial spilled on his hand and it plunged him into the very first LSD experience. So even before the word psychedelic was coined, Albert Hofmann went on his bicycle and described being plunged into a Salvador Dali painting where his legs were pumping the pedals, but he felt like he was moving in a rippling chasm of all sorts of different kind of cartoonish, almost distortions of his reality. He was worried at first that he had driven himself mad, and he didn't understand that these effects would wear off. So at first he locked himself in a room and was concerned that his wife needed to keep the children from him. But after a few hours, this sensation wore off, and he started to become much more reflective. And a few days later, he then knowingly took LSD again and began a lifelong commitment to exploring this amazing, fantastic, as he described it, his problem child, this powerful chemical that altered his consciousness, altered his reality, and also he felt was a real fascinating insight into the human mind. And with his discovery, this sort of launched a new era of research that then looked both back at precedents, so at other kinds of chemicals that created this similar kinds of sensations, distortions of perception, for example, but also created a fascination in the use of LSD, which almost in an unprecedented way, Sandoz made freely available to researchers who had a bona fide interest in this research. And so it also, we think about the different kind of economics of this research, making a drug freely available for that kind of study at this time was also rather risky or radical, and perhaps also then attracted a whole swath of people interested in this kind of research. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's perfect. That was an excellent potted history. So then I guess that brings us up to maybe the late 40s. As you say, Sandoz have made this widely available. There's a lot of research going on, right, in major cities. And then you have Weyburn in Saskatchewan becoming this kind of epicenter of all places of psychedelic research. So what was it about the kind of the political climate, I guess, of Saskatchewan that made that possible?
Yeah, so I think throughout the 1940s, D-lysergic acid diethylamide research, or LSD research as it became known quickly, it was sort of in fits and starts. It wasn't necessarily as attractive as we would come to know it throughout the 1950s in particular. By the end of the 1950s, there were over 1,000 publications that focused on either mescaline or lysergic acid or LSD. It kind of comes up with different names, but essentially the same thing. All Sandoz produced. What happened in Saskatchewan is interesting because for anyone who has been to Weyburn, it does qualify as a city by Saskatchewan standards, but by most standards in the world, no one would think of this as a booming metropolis. It has since been, oil sands have been identified close to it, so it is booming to a small degree now. But at the time, it was a fairly rural place. Perhaps the two sort of claims to fame. One was that it had one of the largest psychiatric hospitals. People who worked there and who were familiar with the terrain have argued that this was the largest Victorian-style asylum in the British Commonwealth. So not insignificant, and whether in fact it was the largest one or not, I think that's disputed, but needless to say, it's a significant building and a significant almost industry within this place that really, I wouldn't say it was the center of town. In fact, geographically it was separated from it, but it certainly sort of focused the energy and a lot of the employment and economy of the town. It was centered around the asylum. In 1951, Humphrey Osmond, the psychiatrist, came from London and within a couple of years became the superintendent of the Saskatchewan Mental Hospital at Weyburn. And he brought with him a real interest and fascination in mescaline. And I think, interestingly, he was brought to Saskatchewan, he answered an ad in the Lancet that had been placed there by the Saskatchewan government. And again, for some sort of Canadiana trivia perhaps, Saskatchewan was the birthplace of what now Canadians call Medicare, or our publicly funded healthcare system, our NHS, if you will. And Saskatchewan was not only the birthplace of it, but the premier and health minister, one and the same person. His home riding and hometown was Weyburn. And so he's sort of at this political epicenter, even though it's a small place off the beaten path. It is definitely a dynamic place in terms of the intellectual energy and the political enthusiasm that came with really mounting the first so-called socialist government in North America, and the first publicly funded healthcare system at a province-wide jurisdiction, which later was picked up by the federal government. So it's kind of an exciting moment. And to have this guy who comes over from London with an interest in mescaline at the same time, and in fact responding directly to an ad for somebody who's willing to head up research that would support these political goals, is something quite remarkable. Maybe even cosmic that these two pieces came together at once. Osmond described later that although Saskatchewan was windswept and cold in the winter, and his wife probably never forgave him for dragging their family from London, England to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, the place did afford him the time and the space and the kind of cultural cushion or cultural support that he needed to sustain his research that began with mescaline and very quickly moved to LSD. Working inside one of these major asylums or major mental hospitals also really stimulated him to think deeply about the plight of people with major mental illnesses. And I think right through to his dying day, he would say that for him, LSD and psychedelics, a word he would come to coin, that these substances were a means to an end for understanding major mental illness, and he really deeply thought about them in a healing way. So I think that combination of factors really led to a really dynamic research space where suddenly this windswept place on the prairies became an epicenter of intellectual energy as people traveled to it in order to participate in the unfolding of what we would later describe as the first psychedelic experimentation.
Right, and as you say, right, the word psychedelic hadn't actually been coined at this point. So was his initial research, was this in the kind of the psychotomimetic paradigm where it was treated as a model of psychosis?
Absolutely. Initially, Osmond very much believed that this was a way to see into the madman's eyes. He described it like that. But this madness mimicking properties was something that really attracted him to. He felt that it was a way that both he, but also his colleagues as psychologists and psychiatrists, but also social workers, government administrators, nurses, social workers, he might even say family members, although I haven't found that exactly, that they could empathize. So not simply to have a proximate experience rather, so that one could sort of study it from that basis, but to provide better care to people, for example, who have schizophrenia, who might be hallucinating, is that even if you have auditory hallucinations more prominently with schizophrenia, having a visual hallucination and just tampering with your sense of self and the edges of yourself or the boundaries of yourself is enough to help to trigger a sense of empathy that is very difficult to accomplish without being able to sort of take yourself out of your own reality. And he felt that that was a really powerful experience that would help people to empathize, whether people were living in institutions or whether people were then later living in communities.